Aware of its considerable influence over his rivals, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas is turning to Syria to get his house in order. But what can Damascus deliver to the Palestinians? Can it deliver anything at all? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Jane Dutton. More than 1 year after Hamas kicked Fatah out of the Gaza Strip, efforts have been made to bring the two rival Palestinian groups together. But with both sides sticking to their conditions, all these efforts achieved absolutely nothing. And in the midst of recent talk over an imminent resumption of inter-Palestinian dialogue, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas turned to Syria. Damascus hosts a number of Palestinian political factions and is said to wield tremendous influence over their leaders. Palestinian President's current visit to Syria comes as Damascus is fully engaged in peace talks, although indirect, with Israel in Turkey. The question, though, remains, will Syria be of any real help to kickstart the Palestinian dialogue?
When the Syrian army left Lebanon after 26 years of involvement there, many could not believe their eyes. Now the Syrians have more to wonder at. Could Damascus be friends with Israel? Could Israel finally give the Golan back to Syria? Yet no one denies that the winds of change are blowing here and that Syria is up to a big enterprise. President Assad's diplomacy intensified since the recent Arab summit in Damascus. With Hezbollah signing a power-sharing deal in Lebanon, he's considering a trip to Beirut to normalize relations. A staunch ally of Hamas, he is receiving the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas and trying to reconcile Palestinian factions. At a Euro-Mediterranean summit in Paris next week, he may sit across the table from Ehud Olmert, if not shake hands with him. And while an Israeli or American strike against Iran is dreaded around the region, Tehran's closest Arab ally is negotiating with Israel. Arabs are watching this with mixed feelings. Damascus has always considered itself the capital of Arab nationalism. This country hosts the biggest number of Arab refugees, above 5 million Iraqis and Palestinians. And this is one of a few places in the Arab world where having an Arab passport is the only visa you need to enter the country. Today, however, there is expressed fear among many Arabs that by signing a peace agreement with Israel, Syria's role in the region will be considerably reduced. Israel wants Syria to shun Hezbollah, Iran and Hamas in exchange for land and peace. A hot issue for debate here in Damascus.
Syria will not turn its back to its allies. Its alliance with Iran, for example. It's not possible to tell Syria, as I said, sit aside, we will hit Iran. Or sit aside, we will hit the Palestinians.
But in effect, if a peace treaty is signed, this would change the balance of relationships. It will limit what Syria can do in terms of official activity. It would give a new dimension to Syria's relation with Khalid Mash'al. It would give a new dimension to Syria's relation with Hezbollah.
Under the constant gaze of history, the Syrians are continually reminded of the tremendous legacy they're left with. Salah ad-Din's armies marched from here and liberated Palestine in 1184. And from the hills of Damascus centuries before, the Arab Islamic Empire saw its influence stretch across the Levant and parts of the Western world. During the last 50 years, Syria fought wars and lost its own territory, the Golan, trying to liberate Palestinian land. But now, the times have changed, the Syrians seem to think. The whole Arab nation is weak and divided. Staying the grand course of the past in a military fashion is proving to be a daunting undertaking. Syria seems to have made a strategic choice. Mohammed Val, Al Jazeera, Damascus.
Joining us to discuss this complex but of course intriguing subject are our guests in Dusseldorf, Dr. Jamal Nazal, a spokesman for Fatah; in Damascus, Marwan Kabalan, a political analyst at Damascus University; in Cairo, political analyst Nabil Zaki. Dr. Jamal Nazal, let me start with you. Mahmoud Abbas at this stage in Syria but not meeting with Hamas. Why not?
Because the conditions are not right for a meeting. All the preparations which have taken place have not led us to draw the conclusion that Hamas is ready for a reconciliation. Just 4 days ago, the troops of Hamas reoccupied the presidential compound of Mahmoud Abbas in Gaza, stepped on his photos and stepped on the photos of Mr. Yasser Arafat. So we think Hamas is not ready yet for a dialogue. Besides, there is time.
But excuse me, let me interrupt very quickly. There seems to be a media war on both of you, coming from both sides. I mean, this seems to be a real imminent breakdown at the moment.
Yeah, well, the media war is less harmless than the real war, which Hamas is undertaking on the ground. I have a list here of 50 names of people who were kidnapped by Hamas itself. This is the list. I hope you can see it. And these are the images of people which Hamas is now torturing in its dungeons. In spite of all the painful events of the last year, we still very much hope that Hamas will maintain its head, will keep its head, will resort to sanity and wisdom and go back to the national unity. This hope does exist till this day.
We did ask Hamas to come and join us, and they did pull out at the last moment. So, Mr. Zaki, if I can just ask you to try and think on their behalf. I mean, the last time Mahmoud Abbas and Khalid Mashal met was in Mecca in February 2007. Surely they have a lot to say to each other.
Yes, of course. And I believe that there are still some efforts to continue or to start the dialogue in Cairo in the next days. Maybe today there was some talk about fixing a date to start such talks. There are hopes that this dialogue will be possible and fruitful this time, especially because there are a lot of dangers in the region. You know, the ghost of a new war is looming here and there. And in this case, we have to consider that maybe in a case of a new war against Iran, for example, the Palestinian cause will be delayed for another 10 years. That's why it's important to try to make pressure upon the United States and Israel to try to solve the problem as soon as possible and to make to reunify the Palestinians is a main, or maybe it's necessary to achieve this goal.
Okay, and the talks underway at the moment are happening in Syria, Mr. Kabalan. What do you think Syria has to offer Mahmoud Abbas?
Well, I think for the Syrian government, it's extremely important for it right now to put pressure on both Hamas and the Palestinian Authority in order to set, this reconciliation process in motion. And I believe for the Syrian government, this is extremely important for many reasons. First of all, for Syria, it wants to activate its role as the chairman of the Arab Summit. And by trying to bring both Abbas and Mashal together, Syria believes that this is part of its role, as I said, as a chairman of the Arab Summit. On the other hand, the Syrian government, which is involved in peace negotiations with the Israelis, it's important for the Syrian government to see some progress on the Palestinian track, because the Syrian government cannot, after all, sign any or conclude any peace treaty with the Israelis without having seen some progress on the Palestinian track. So this is, in my opinion, why the Syrian government is trying to bring the two men together.
And of course, they're the only ones who are really capable of exerting any pressure on Hamas.
Well, I think the Syrian government does have influence on Hamas, because we know that the leaders of Hamas, or most of them actually, they live in Damascus. And the Syrian government has long actually supported Hamas in its struggle against the Israeli occupation. So I think, yes, Syria in many ways can put some pressure on Hamas. But Syria is not trying to do that by only pressuring Hamas to do something. But I think they will ask also Mahmoud Abbas to give some concessions. On the other hand, because if the two sides actually do not come to terms with one another, I think this whole reconciliation process will collapse. And this
let me put that point to Dr. Nizal. Do you think Mahmoud Abbas's weakness at the moment will push him into some sort of unity talks with Hamas, steered by Syria?
Well, I don't share the notion that Mr. Abbas is weak in any sense. He still enjoys a great deal of support among the Palestinian population.
But he hasn't been able to achieve anything for the Palestinians. A bit of a deadlock as far as he's concerned. If anything, Hamas has at least made some movement with the Israelis to bring a truce to Gaza. But Mahmoud Abbas is looking weak.
Well, this is not true. He has managed to gather the international community around himself, starting from the Annapolis process and the Conference of Paris, which followed up the Annapolis conference, and recently the conference in Berlin, with all the donor countries pledging big amounts of money to help rebuild the Palestinian National Authority, the headquarters of the Palestinian ministries. These are good
despite
points
all
for
those diplomatic
President
efforts, I mean, you know, Fatah and Hamas are no closer to reconciling.
No, they're not, because Hamas is not ready to restore the situation in Gaza as it was before the coup d'etat, which it has committed a year ago. Hamas's project is based on controlling the Gaza Strip, trying to do the same thing in the West Bank. This is a very dangerous project. Hamas is a very dangerous movement with criminal potential that has a fascist face, and it is a very big disappointment to Islamists movement all over the Arab and Islamic world to see this failed attempt of an Islamic party to take over the power using violent means in Palestine. It sends a very bad signal to the entire world about Islamic movements, having had our bloody experience with the Hamas, which is not ready as of now to restore the situation in Gaza as it once used to be, peaceful and unifying in one nation.
Okay, let's bring it back to Syria's influence over these possible talks, and in particular, Hamas. Is Hamas concerned at Syria's attempts to become friends with Israel, Mr. Kabalan?
I think using the term friend with Israel is, is quite unsuitable in this particular stage. I think I really wonder if Syria would be a friend of Israel any time in the future. I mean, what we are seeking right now is a peace treaty, and peace can be
But at least they have made
hot.
overtures, excuse me interrupting, towards each other. So it is a first step in possibly some sort of normalization of relationships.
Well, I mean, it's too early to talk about normalization, because Syria and Israel spent almost 10 years negotiating a peace treaty over the 90s, and they could not actually conclude one, and that did not lead to any sort of normalization between the two countries. I think we are way far from any sort of normalization between the two countries, and I think normalization at the end of the day is something between people, not between governments.
Okay, let's bring it back quickly to what pressure this might have on Hamas.
Well, I think Hamas actually is a very pragmatic. At the end of the day, I mean, what we are talking about between Hamas and Fatah is a classic struggle for power between these two movements over who really represent the Palestinian people. And if you may allow me, I mean, to comment on what my friend my colleague from Germany said. I really regret what the terms that he used. I mean, he used exactly the Israeli terms in order to describe Hamas. I think what the Fatah and Hamas really need to do is to find a formula to share power between them that would, at the end of the day, require the two movements.
It is not between two movements. It's between Hamas. It's a conflict between Hamas and the PLO. The PLO is a group of organizations consisting of 13 organizations who are unified under one umbrella. Hamas is the only one dancing outside this row. So the only power in Palestine which broke the national unity is Hamas. You have to agree with me on this.
Well, I think that's a good time for a short break. When we come back, could both Syria and Egypt converge efforts to push inter-Palestinian dialogue? Stay with Inside Story.